is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Fears of escalation. AP reports a rocket that hit a Polish village was probably fired by Ukrainian forces, and an incoming Russian missile. We're live in Brussels. Meanwhile, a barrage of missiles target Kyiv and other locations across the country, knocking out power for 7 million households. President Biden calls the attacks merciless. Plus, it's official. Donald Trump says he's running for president in 2024, complicating the race for the Republican Party. So let's look at the markets. I think we may also get some lines on the ECB. And actually, if you look at U.S. futures and European equities, Danny, they're rising. The risk of subsiding about an escalation with NATO.
Exactly, Francine. There's a lot to be concerned about, potentially adding to that. We just out now, Francine, have the ECB Financial Stability Review. They are warning that record inflation is going to be a problem for banks. It's going to be a problem for governments, that lenders may need bigger provisions amid this worsening outlook. Some of the other lines I want to walk you through here, they're saying that the price squeeze is hurting people's ability to service debts. Again, that goes to the issue of inflation that they're flagging. The real estate markets, one of the positives here, say they might be at a turning point, but rate hikes are weighing more heavily on public finances. They're also warning here, Francine, about asset prices, saying that they still appear stretched despite the drops that we have seen. Here's what DeGuindos said, the ECB vice president, in this release. Our assessment is that risks to financial stability have increased, while a technical recession in the euro area has become more lively. So, Francine, these are absolutely big picture macro risks from inflation, the issue with debt, and potentially asset prices that the ECB is flagging here.
Yeah, leverage is the main concern. If you go to 1% to potentially 5% interest rates, that's going to cause a lot of turmoil. Now, don't miss, thank you, Danny. Don't miss our interview with the ECB Vice President. He's Luis DeGuindos, and that's at 12 p.m. London time. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, from here throughout the day. The big story is, of course, that rocket launch that killed 2 farmers in Poland. Initial assessments by the U.S. now indicate a rocket that hit the Polish village was fired by Ukrainian forces at an incoming Russian one. That's according to a report by the Associated Press, citing 3 U.S. officials. Now, G7 leaders who were gathered in Bali for the G20 summit held an emergency meeting on the strike, which came during a wave of Russian rocket attacks on Ukraine. Now, let's bring in Bloomberg's Piotr Skomilowski in Warsaw and Anne-Marie Hordern at the G20 summit in Bali. So, Piotr, what do we know so far about the strike? Who's talking about this being, and we know that actually both sides a lot of times use Russian missiles, because it could very well be the Ukrainian side trying to defend themselves.
Good morning. Indeed, the situation has really changed over the course of the last 12 hours. Initially, we obviously heard that this might have been stray missiles coming from Russia. At this point, what the Polish side has been saying or telling us is that the explosion took place in Przewodowo, which is a small town about 4 miles away from the Ukrainian border on the Polish side, obviously, so inside NATO. 2 people are killed, farm workers. What the way Polish side is describing this is that it's the Russian-produced missile that hit the place. Now, we also heard from one of the ministers, junior ministers, on TV this morning, saying that actually Ukraine is also in the possession of this type of missile. So it's hard to say at this point who exactly fired. But judging from what we're hearing from different officials, it seems like the panic in terms of this potentially being Russia has eased a bit in that sense. At the same time, in Brussels, NATO ambassadors are meeting right now, and Poland is still weighing its options. Is trying to it raised a possibility that it might actually trigger the so-called Article 4 of the NATO treaty, so the consultations. But whether it's going to do this, we'll only find out once the meeting starts and once we get some kind of communication from them.
Yeah, so the investigation is still ongoing, and we know that the NATO ambassadors are meeting as we speak. Anne-Marie, the timing of this at first sent shockwaves also because it seemed yesterday at the G20 that Russia was more and more isolated, even maybe losing, or if we don't go as far as saying losing, certainly having less support from China and India.
Yes, certainly. And what we've seen, Francine, from the communique coming out of the G20 is that, quote, most countries condemn the war and Russia's actions, and not just what it means on the humanitarian front and obviously the lives of civilians in Ukraine, but also the impact on the global economy. And then we saw a hastily put together emergency meeting. President Biden was joined by leaders of other G7 countries as well as NATO countries, Europe, France, Italy, Canada, and the likes. And what President Biden said after the meeting is that he says the preliminary information contests that it was fired from Russia. He says we have to wait and see, though. He wants to complete the investigation. And just speaking here now, Olaf Scholz of Germany is reiterating that, saying it would be irresponsible to decide what actually happened until the investigation is complete. But Olaf Scholz also said, and this is also critical, and this really echoes what President Biden and other leaders have been saying on the sidelines of the G20, that there would be no incident on the border of Ukraine and Poland if there was not for Putin's invasion of Ukraine.
Yeah, and Anne-Marie, I know you've spoken to the NATO Secretary General several times over the last couple of months. He has always said that no matter what happens, if something happens at the border, we need to keep the channel of communication with the Russian military open. Is there still an understanding that NATO will try to do whatever it takes not to get involved?
Well, President Biden spoke to his counterpart in Poland today, Andrzej Duda, and he said that his commitment to NATO is ironclad. We have the envoys now speaking at NATO, and really it's a wait-and-see moment. What we heard from Poland last night, Francine, is that they were likely to trigger Article 4, which would be a meeting, a consensus meeting, so they can gather the information and decide what to do next. This would come before the more serious triggering of Article 5. But really, the entire worry from the West at the start of this invasion on February 24th was that this could potentially spread beyond Ukraine's borders. And that is a concern that obviously what happened overnight is really on the forefront in the minds. But we should really note that leaders are trying to invoke calm, and they do not want to make any judgments whatsoever until they have this investigation complete.
Yeah, and Piotr, going back to Anne-Marie's, very true point, is that again, this is 6 kilometers from the border, and it's not the first. It's maybe the first time that we saw a missile actually on foreign territory. But I think there was a 6,000-ton unmanned drone, then ended up in a neighboring country in March.
Indeed, yes. So it's obviously a bit of a change in that sense that we're talking about missiles here. So it's raised a lot of concerns in Poland. Obviously, what surprised us and what surprised a lot of people is that how cautious Polish side has always been has been since the news broke in not trying to apportion blame here right from the start. Poland has been a very stout supporter of Ukraine right from the start of the conflict, and they've been very easy to go after Russia and push for a very tough line on sanctions, on going after the Putin regime. So it was interesting to see that they didn't want to amplify the situation. And right now the investigation is ongoing. We are going to hear a bit more once the meeting of National Security Council is going to happen at midday here, and probably a bit more from the investigation itself. At this point, foreign experts are involved. It's all coordinated with NATO, and we're going to see how this is going to figure, develop in the coming hours.
Yep. All right, thank you both for joining us, Piotr and Anne-Marie there. Anne-Marie Hordern at the G20 summit in Bali, and Bloomberg's Piotr Skolimowski in Warsaw. Now, we'll have plenty more throughout the day, of course, on what happened overnight. Staying with that story, Ukraine's ambassador to Singapore also spoke to us earlier about the need to establish the facts. Take a listen.
We need to wait till the investigation is over to see what is the outcome of it. We in Ukraine have faced so many attempts by Russia to hide the facts, to go through its normal modus operandi when they deny their involvement, when they blame the victim, and when they move away from the perpetrator side.
Ukraine's ambassador to Singapore, Katerina Zelenko, speaking to Bloomberg TV there at the New Economy Forum here. Now, coming up, an interview you don't want to miss. That is the president of Ukraine. We'll hear directly from him tomorrow, Volodymyr Zelensky, when he joins the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. That's Thursday afternoon in Asia, Thursday morning in Europe. Coming up, we'll be talking geopolitical tensions, energy security, and all things Europe with Agnes Balázs, Chief European Strategist at Barings. That's coming up shortly, and this is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Singapore. Now let's get back to the markets. We did see UK inflation rising more than expected in October to a 41-year high of 11.1%, adding pressure to the Bank of England to raise interest rates again. Now let's talk about central banks and, of course, some of the pressures that we're also seeing in currencies across the world. We're joined now by Agnes Balázs, Chief European Strategist at Barings. Agnes, as always, thank you so much for joining us. How much do you worry about the UK economy going forward and what we could expect from the Chancellor tomorrow?
Good morning, Francine. So before this inflation release, which is higher than expected, even higher than the Bank of England's forecast, there was some hope that the fiscal discipline that is expected to be announced by Chancellor Hunt tomorrow would provide some respite to the Bank of England, so that it is fighting this very delicate rising inflation in the midst of a recession that has already started in the UK. But the fact that inflation keeps rising, keeps passing through to core goods and services, and that food prices was so high in this morning's release for October, means that the ECB will just have to keep going on a little bit, no matter what, how tight the fiscal package of consolidation that Jeremy Hunt is going to announce tomorrow.
So, Agnes, overall, is there a danger that actually interest rates have to rise so high? And I don't know whether you think we've reached peak inflation in the UK or in Europe, but that interest rates will have to be put up so aggressively that there will be a significant downturn, not the kind of downturn that we're expecting now for economies.
So this thing with the UK that's a little bit different with the euro area and the US is that there's 3 shocks instead of 2. There's Brexit, there's the pandemic, and then there's the war. And the problem is that Brexit by itself reduced the labor force in the UK. It actually halved population due to immigration, and the labor force participation fell 1 percentage point as a result of the pandemic. There are long-term illness, and there's also early retirements that have participated to this reduction in the labor force. As a result of that, UK wages have actually increased 50% more in the UK than in the euro area, for example. And therefore, the pressures on inflation are multiple. And it's quite likely that the Bank of England, is far from having peaked, and it will just have to go steady, but for longer than maybe potentially in the US or in the euro area.
Agnes, why is it so much harder for the UK and actually for inflation in the UK? Is it the composition? Is it the type labor market that was also exacerbated by Brexit?
Yeah, exactly. So this Brexit created a labor market tightness that is increasing wages. And we know that when wages increase, they allow inflation to pass through more easily, simply because the purchasing power is maintained higher for longer. And this is not what is happening in the euro area. And therefore, these lower labor force participation creating shortages on the labor market, and therefore higher wages, particularly at the lower end of the pay pay scale, which is much broader in terms of quantity, makes the pass-through of inflation to prices in the future more permanent. And therefore, fighting that means the ECB has to reduce, the Bank of England has to reduce demand and not just fight inflation expectations from the supply side and energy and food price increases.
Agnes, are we going to start importing inflation from China when they reopen?
Yeah, so that is the big question. That's actually a positive question. If China finally manages to reopen, that should be a good news, not only for China, but for the world. And this question of inflation is nagging, of course. We want China to be dynamic, to be vibrant, to start importing again. But the thing is, how will China reopen without sufficient vaccinations? I was going to say as much vaccinations as in the rest of the world, but just sufficient vaccinations to make the elderly population safe to this reopening. So in my mind, it's likely that the reopening is really slow and gradual. So we've seen the Chinese government announce a number of measures that
Oh, I think we just lost Agnes, actually. Some of the satellite connections, sometimes it happens. We'll get back to Agnes to have a full roundup of some of the things, the benefits, if, of course, China reopens, but also some of the concerns, for example, because of the use of energy prices, which could push up the price of oil even more. Agnes Belleche, Chief European Strategist at Barings. Now, we'll have plenty more on the inflation picture across the world. Also coming up, the U.S. and the EU urge caution as investigations into the origin of the rocket strike on Poland continue. So stay with us for a reaction from Brussels. This is Bloomberg.
FTX is one of these absolute travesties in the history of financial markets. I mean,
people will lose billions of dollars collectively.
People are going to lose billions of dollars. And that undermines trust in all financial markets.
What should the industry do to survive and make itself better? My opinion is more collaboration.
Asset under management in the FTX is large, so it may actually hit the other bankruptcy. In morning, there's actually one new report that BlockFi is a lending platform may actually file the bankruptcy, so it may actually continue a little bit.
I think it's quite contained right now, and the broader market is still seeing a lot of liquidity, and the authorities, I think, will be there to address any issues in crypto.
Well, attendees of the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore speaking there on the rapid downfall of crypto exchange FTX. Now, the fallout of the collapse has seen crypto's total market cap fall below $1 trillion. Now, let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Donald Trump has formally entered the 2024 U.S. presidential race. Minutes before announcing his candidacy at Mar-a-Lago, Trump's campaign filed federal paperwork to confirm that he is running again. Candidates endorsed by Trump floundered in key races in last week's midterm elections, prompting calls for some Republicans for the party to move on.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
NASA has launched its most powerful rocket in 50 years, sending an uncrewed capsule skyward on a 25-day mission to orbit the moon and return safely to Earth. The mission, called Artemis 1, marks the inaugural flight of both the SLS rocket and the Orion crew capsule. It kicks off NASA's multi-mission Artemis program, which is focused on sending astronauts, including the first woman and the first person of color, back to the moon's surface by as early as 2025. Sources say Russia is expected to agree to extend a UN-brokered deal allowing exports of Ukrainian grain from the Black Sea. Meanwhile, speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum, the Cargill CEO says food prices will probably decline next year, even as global crop stockpiles stay very tight. The boss of America's largest private company says crop demand can be met with higher output. Global news 24 hours a day on air and a Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Laura, thanks so much. Laura, right there with your top news. Now, coming up, we go back to our top story, the US and the EU urging caution as investigations into the origin of the rocket strike on Poland continue. We'll be live in Brussels. Now, a reminder, the attack killed 2 people at a village about 6 kilometers from the frontier with Ukraine. It did come as tensions were escalating. They were certainly high with Russia over its February invasion of Ukraine. We understand in the past 24 hours that Moscow had fired missile barrages at Ukrainian infrastructure earlier in the day, causing energy outages across the country. We now understand that this one missile that could have triggered Article 4 and then Article 5 and then forced all of the nations of NATO to engage in conflict could now come from the Ukrainian side. This is what we've been told on the ground here in Singapore with many security experts, is that actually both sides, both the Russians and the Ukrainians, sometimes use Russian-made missiles. This is Bloomberg. Fears of escalation. AP reports a rocket that hit a Polish village was probably fired by Ukrainian forces at an incoming Russian missile. Meanwhile, a barrage of missiles target Kyiv and other locations across the country, knocking out power for 7 million households. President Biden calls the attacks merciless. Plus, UK inflation hits a 41-year high as soaring energy prices add to pressure on the Bank of England and the government. So good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance early edition, everyone. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Singapore for the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden and European leaders are urging caution after a rocket struck a Polish village and killed 2 people just over the border from Ukraine. Now, for more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak. Natalia, thank you for joining us. So what do we know so far? I know it's a very fluid, conversation. I know that there's still an investigation on the ground. What caused this and how is NATO reacting?
Yes, as you said, Francine, we're still waiting on more information, but we're getting some bits and pieces trickling in. U.S. President Joe Biden said last night there was information that suggested the missile had not been sent from Russia. Some officials are suggesting that it could have been Ukraine's missile defense sending that projectile off course. These questions are still open, but we'll know more after a meeting of the NATO ambassadors that's ongoing at the moment, where they're discussing this issue. And NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will brief the press around 12:30 Brussels time.
Okay, Natalia, thank you so much, of course, for the update. And we now, keep on top of the official response, really, to see exactly what was happening. We have always, on this channel, urged caution before jumping to conclusions. Our Natalia Drozdiak there from our Brussels bureau. Now, we're also joined to talk about the markets, but also the frontier of geopolitics and some of the risks out there, which are many, by Axel Weber. He's the former chairman of UBS and chair of the Institute of International Finance. It's been a long day. I can't even talk, Axel, anymore.
Right.
Thank you
Good
so
to have
much
me. Thank you.
For joining us. Look, there's a lot going on in the world. We talk about leverage. We talk about how you deploy capital. We talk about geopolitics and crypto. Right now, what do you worry about the most for our global economy?
I think what we saw over the G20 meetings recently has taken some of my biggest fears away, that we would see a continued escalation of the conflict between China and the United States. That is, in my view, one of the most dominant factors for the global economy. You cannot run the global economy without China, and it's good that the US and China are trying to work together more being here in the region in Singapore, as we both are today, it's of vital importance that the region here continues to be part of the global economy and continues to integrate in the global economy. I would say the tailwinds for globalization from the last 20 years has been largely driven by China being integrated into the global economy. And if that were to change, you would see massive headwinds for the global economy.
It just feels like it's a bit hot and cold. I know yesterday they really tried to de-escalate when we heard, for the first time, a face-to-face meeting between the two presidents. But is this about global supremacy? Is this about who comes on top in terms of the economic superpower? So are we still going to see this intense competition?
No, I think, and most of the investors here at the Bloomberg meeting will tell you that China is a massive opportunity for most of the Western companies, and it will continue to be an opportunity in the future. There have been, conflicts. I mean, when President Trump tried to take China a bit out of the trade, international trade, many of the European countries didn't follow that path. And Europe continues to be very dependent on good relations with the Americas and good relations with China and the Asian Pacific region. We live in a global economy, and if we were to see any setback of globalization, and China is the major new factor in the global economy over the last 20 years, we would see much less prosperity, and much less prosperity in the weakest and in the least developed regions of this world. So I think it is mandatory that US leaders and Chinese leaders put all these geopolitics aside and really look at what is good at this stage of the global economy, where we're just coming out of a pandemic. We've had major challenges after the financial crisis to really try and work together for a better global economy. That's what we need.
You left UBS about 6 months ago, just over 6 months ago, and I know you have never really been a believer in crypto. How should a big global bank now look at cryptocurrencies after the implosion of FTX?
Well, so what we always offered was if banks wanted to offer services to their clients on crypto, we allowed them and we helped them get that done, international linkages, etc. But we never looked at crypto as something that would be an asset universe that we would invest in or recommend investors to invest in. So we've been pretty hands-off in looking at crypto as an asset class that we want to help develop. And actually, some of the problems are the same as they showed up here with the problems we saw over the last couple of days. Is what is the intrinsic value of a digital asset that is being created, unless it is actually a securitization of a physical asset that is done in digital form? And so I think cryptocurrencies have two big problems. The first one is crypto means you hide the identity very often of the people involved in the transaction. That is something that banks cannot be involved in. Actually, transparency and beneficial owner is very key.
But what about institutional investors? So again, it's very difficult. If you're a client, and I imagine clients would come up to you and say, like, why can we not make more money in the crypto space? Right. And what did we live through in the last 3 days? Are we talking about fraud, or is it just the intrinsic value of what we're trading?
I haven't followed it that closely to be able to pass a judgment of whether it was fraud or anything. You really need to be in the weeds on this. But a sure sign is that the institutions, that do financial supervision are opening an investigation. So this will be looked into. But I do think the general problem that we have is many of these cryptocurrencies live of the expectation of a continued growth over time. And that's what creates the price dynamics. And we've seen the ability of cryptocurrencies to be a stable investment. We've seen that pretty much undermined over the last couple of years. So yes, there is an upside that many investors take. You invest when it's low and you try and sell it when it's high. But that's a very hard point to have. But in general, the value preservation of cryptocurrencies has been really not showing a great record because of its volatility. And then, the other point is really it isn't an internationally recognized means of payments. It's very hard to move from crypto into real currencies. And so you are invested in an asset class that has no real equivalent to it. And finality of payment is not necessarily ensured by many cryptocurrencies either. So there are some problems with the construction. Central banks are trying to move into digital currencies. And I think that will be a much more stable construct because it will replace analog money with more digital money, which now really matches payment patterns of many of the consumers. But crypto, I'm still skeptical of the entire construction.
So, Axel, there are two big banks in Switzerland. You spent most of your lifetime trying to beat your competitor, Credit Suisse. I mean, what's happening at Credit Suisse? What will happen to this bank, given all of the turmoil and travails we've been reporting on?
Well, so one thing I can say is, yes, we have, I think, over the years, really established a relatively good brand in UBS, and I was glad to be part of this 10-year transformation. And of course, by comparison, whether you compare it to other competitors or to Credit Suisse, we've been doing well both on an absolute scale and a relative scale. I know most of the current management and chair of Credit Suisse. They're really focused on getting things done, and they've been part of the UBS turnaround story. Both the new CEO, Uli Kerner, he's a very structured, very organized person that knows strategy, has been implementing good strategies at UBS and the asset management. And so I think he will focus on taking the risks down in the bank, which is badly needed. And Axel Lehmann has, both have been operating officers. They know the intrinsic working of the bank at UBS. And so I think they will get the efficiency of the bank going. Where I do see a risk was that basically I think the risk culture, which is very hard to really foster, that the risk culture has somewhat deteriorated at Credit Suisse. We always tried to hold our risk culture up. We had very elaborated processes around managing risk and understanding risk. And I think if you go through a period like they have, you need to put risk culture and risk focus back at the core of the bank. And I think the individuals that are there now and the executives, they will do that. Yeah. They know that risk culture matters.
But could we see the two banks merge?
I think that is pretty unlikely because, we had discussions in the past about consolidation in the European banking industry. Really, the issue at the moment is unless there is a limit and unless there is a clear understanding of the downside risks in Credit Suisse, you will have a very hard time for any international competitor, including Swiss competitors, to think about a merger, because their shareholders will really want to see that this bank is on an improving trajectory. And so I do think that Credit Suisse has raised capital. They actually have their shareholders behind them, and they have everything they need to come out of this difficult period. It will be an upward battle. And when I joined UBS, I started saying, look, this has been an icon of Switzerland. It needs to be rebuilt. But I also said it will take 10 years. So this is not a quick fix. This will take time.
Do they have 10 years?
Well, I'm not sure they have 10 years, but I do think that they shouldn't look for quick wins. They really need to restructure the bank. And when we made our announcement, actually the markets initially were skeptical that you could focus away from from investment banking onto wealth management. The other Swiss bank has pretty much the same core of a wealth manager, but their investment bank is way larger and way more active in markets, and therefore their overall results depend a lot more on the volatility of markets through the investment bank. They need to trim that back, and that is a process that will take some time. But I think, having seen and done it at UBS, it's something that will work because the core of Swiss banks around wealth management is really an internationally intact business.
Okay, Axel, as always, thank you so much for your time. Axel Weber there, the former chairman of UBS and chair of the Institute of International Finance. Now, we'll have plenty more, of course, throughout the day. Also get the latest on the situation in Poland and the war in Ukraine. We speak to Tony Brenton, the UK's former ambassador to Russia, next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Singapore at our Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Now, initial assessments by the U.S. indicate that a rocket that hit a Polish village was actually fired by Ukrainian forces at an incoming Russian missile. Now, that's according to a report by the Associated Press citing 3 U.S. officials. Now, G7 leaders gathered in Bali for the G20 summit, held an emergency meeting on the strike. We're now joined by Sir Tony Brenton. He's a fellow of Cambridge University, former British ambassador to Russia. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. What do we know, so far about this hike? There was a lot of concern that this would have been a Russian strike because Vladimir Putin is also internationally increasingly isolated.
Yeah, no, there was initially a lot of fear that this was a Russian strike because a lot of Russian rockets were flying around in any case, all of them aimed at Ukraine. And if it had been a Russian strike, whether accidental or deliberate, that then raised the question of whether NATO could be moving towards war with Russia. I mean, NATO, under its Article 5 of its charter, everybody's committed to defending everyone else. If the Poles had asked for that defense, then it would have been at the very least embarrassing for other members of NATO to say no. Now, mercifully, it looks increasingly as if it wasn't a Russian strike, and so people who said some pretty aggressive things early on are beginning to modify their words slightly. I think the important lesson from this is actually how escalation could come out of an accident at any time connected to this war, and therefore the consequence of what has just happened may be to encourage people to think more in terms of getting the Ukrainians and the Russians talking to each other with a view to beginning to end hostilities.
But Ambassador, you understand Russia more than most people, full stop. How is Russia's war in Ukraine changing? We saw yesterday strikes, so less troop combats, but really quite aggressive strikes, for example, to take down Ukrainian infrastructure.
Yeah, I mean, Russia's abandoned, it has not been able to achieve its original objectives, which was in effect to make Ukraine a colony again of Russia. They've lost very badly on the battlefield. They've been forced to reduce their objectives steadily. They're now in a position where they're doing two things effectively. First of all, they're pulling in their defensive lines, hence the fact that they pulled out of Kherson last week, to a more defensible area that they can defend. And secondly, in order partly to justify this to the real hardliners back in Russia, but also with a vague hope that it may encourage the Ukrainians, at least to the negotiating table, they've launched this series of waves of attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, which is exactly what we saw again yesterday. Now, I think the first part of this, which is, as I say, to withdraw to defensible lines and hopefully sit out the winter in the hope that things will have improved for them militarily by next spring, at least puts a pause on things, although how successful it's going to be in view of huge Ukrainian success on the battlefield in the past remains to be seen. The other half, which is attacking Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, the history of London during the Blitz, for example, is that those sorts of attacks tend to strengthen civilian resistance rather than weaken them.
I mean, does this latest, I guess, fear that we had over the last 24 hours, even if it is a Ukrainian missile that was trying to intercept a Russian one, change the support that the West gives to Ukraine? Are we going to see more anti-missile, help and weapons being sent?
Well, what it doesn't do, I mean, if it had been a Russian missile, there would have undoubtedly been very strong calls for yet more Western support for Ukraine. It's turned out not to be the case. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians can claim that the accident that happened was caused by the Russian assault, and therefore there is a case for more Western help, and that argument may have some weight. But as I say, I think the real impact of all of this is that it's a reminder of how dangerous this war is. It doesn't take any more than a rather small accident to raise a serious fear that not just Ukraine, but all of NATO is going to be at war with Russia, with all sorts of really quite scary implications for escalation in the future. And therefore, as I say, I hope that one of the consequences of this will be that people think more actively about moving towards negotiating an end to the war.
Ambassador, very quickly, what's the way out of this? How does this be escalated permanently? Do we need to, like some people say, give Vladimir Putin an out?
There's no easy way out, and there's no appetite to give Vladimir Putin an easy way out. The Ukrainians at the moment believe rightly that they're winning the war and have set some really very demanding objectives like Russian reparations, Russian war trials, Russian withdrawal from all of Ukraine, which the Russians are simply not going to be ready to meet. So the prospects for negotiations at the moment are actually very limited. It remains to be seen actually what happens over the next 2 or 3 months. If the Russians do effect a pause, if things do, as it were, bog down, and it looks as if we're in a long-term stalemate, then there begins to be hope for negotiations. But I'm afraid we're still some way from that at the moment.
Ambassador, thank you so much. Sir Tony Brunton, they're a fellow of Cambridge University and former British ambassador to Russia, joining us, of course, on the latest 24 hours. Now let's get straight to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Laura Wright. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Francine. Authorities in the US and the Bahamas are said to be discussing the possibility of bringing Sam Bankman-Fried to America for questioning over the collapse of crypto firm FTX. Bankman-Fried has tweeted that he would meet regulators in person and that he believed FTX US had enough money to repay customers. Apple is said to be preparing to begin sourcing chips from a plant under construction in Arizona, marking a major step toward reducing the company's reliance on Asia. Bloomberg learned that CEO Tim Cook made the comments at an internal meeting in Germany. He added that Apple may also expand its supply to include chips from plants in Europe. Bloomberg's been told that Goldman Sachs paid over $12 million to a veteran executive who complained internally about a toxic workplace for women. Sources say the bank settled with the departing partner 2 years ago in a deal that kept secret her detailed account of senior executives making vulgar and dismissive comments about women. Goldman says it disputes the report and that it contains factual errors. That's the Bloomberg Business Flash, Francine.
Thank you so much, Laura. Now, coming up, UK Chancellor Jeremy Hunt is sent to confirm he's lifting the cap on bankers' bonuses when he delivers his autumn statement tomorrow. We'll have plenty more on that. Plus, UK CPI at a 41-year high. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in Singapore. So, UK inflation rose more than expected in October to a 41-year high of 11.1%, adding pressure, of course, on the Bank of England to raise interest rates again, as well as on the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's government.
We're facing these global economic shocks. We are going to have to take some difficult decisions at home to protect ourselves against those, and to start getting a grip of inflation, reducing it and limiting the increase in mortgage rates.
Well, joining us now is Bloomberg's John Stepek. John, you fabulous, a readout that you have, of course, a management, you have a newsletter on wealth. What does this mean for how people will fear their wealth evaporate in the UK?
Well, I mean, it's pretty grim, to be honest, Francine. So on the one hand, you've got inflation rising. And it's rising above wages, so people's wages aren't keeping up with inflation. And then we've also got the autumn statement coming up tomorrow. And although the Chancellor has released an awful lot of different suggestions about how he might raise money, one thing we can almost guarantee is that the majority of it will come through fiscal drag. So fiscal drag is basically where you freeze the thresholds for various kind of tax, for income tax, the pensions, lifetime allowance, inheritance tax, and that'll drag more people into becoming higher rate taxpayers and also into tax bans and liable to taxes they haven't had to pay before. So, yeah, on balance, I hate to say it, but it's not going to be good for the majority of us, which I suppose is what Jeremy Hunt has been trying to warn everyone for the last fortnight.
Yeah, and so, of course, all eyes on the fiscal statement tomorrow. What are you expecting there? And again, you're looking at it through the lens of wealth and people trying to protect their wealth.
Yeah, well, as I said, I think the main thing to be looking out for is fiscal drag. And this is where, so more people are going to be paying higher rates of income tax. More people are going to find that they might end up being liable to the pensions lifetime allowance. And that means that, I mean, there aren't that many things that you can do to protect yourself from this. But the best thing to do is to be aware of where you are personally with your personal finances, and then look at ways that you might combat this. Making more pension contributions, for example.
Yeah. John, thank you so much. John Stepek there with our renewed effort here at Bloomberg. I think he has a newsletter called Money Distilled. Tomorrow, our special coverage of the UK autumn statement. This is Bloomberg.
Hitting missiles on NATO territory? This is a Russian missile attack on collective security. This is a very significant escalation.
It's highly unlikely that Russia intended to attack Poland with 2 stray rockets. But there needs to be accountability for what happened.
We stand with people of Poland. We know how it is. And of course, we are ready to support our partners and friends in this situation.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition, with Anna Edwards, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
It's 10 a.m. in London, 5 a.m. in New York, and 6 p.m. in Hong Kong. Our top stories today. President Biden and key European leaders urge caution after a rocket hit a village in Poland. Uncertainty remains over who fired it and from where. NATO ambassadors meet today. It's official. Donald Trump is running for president again. His announcement comes as some Republicans are saying it's time for the former president to move on. Inflation hasn't been this high in the UK since 1981. The latest numbers show the consumer price index up more than 11% in the last year. Welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. And Kailey, risk assets certainly under pressure yesterday after we saw that rocket fall in Poland. Still a lot of questions as to who exactly fired it, from where, and all the details surrounding that. We wait for those. Some fairly measured language from Western leaders helping to diffuse some of the risk aversion.
Yeah, I think, Anna, at this point, there's still a lot that we don't know or don't have confirmed. So markets definitely reacting hesitantly around all this news flow. But the geopolitical risk question mark did create somewhat of a drag on risk sentiment in the Asian session overnight. The MSCI Asia Pacific Index as a whole down about 0.3%. So no major losses, but still not a lot of people seem to have conviction to buy in the overnight session. Now, one stock that did buck the general downtrend, Tencent, it rose 2% during the trading day, but after the close in Asia is when it reported its results. Revenue missed expectations, but the other big headline is it's giving away almost its entire Meituan stake. So that may be part of an attempt to ease regulatory concerns from Beijing about this company having a bit too much power and influence. So we'll see how those shares react once they reopen again tomorrow. Then in foreign exchange, of course, geopolitical risk is really dragging on a lot of Asian currencies, most of them weakening against the U.S. dollar. One of the big underperformers is the South Korean won, weaker by about 0.6% to the 13.25 level. And what's interesting is the Japanese yen not really getting a haven bid today. The dollar actually stronger fractionally against the yen. Right now, dollar yen trading at 139.44, Matt.
I'll be watching that closely. The dollar obviously very key to the market story. It has come down a little bit after the gain yesterday amid geopolitical tensions. Right now we see S&P futures rising about 0.2%. We closed up at 39.91 yesterday, so just short of that 4,000 mark. Could we break through it today? It looks very likely that we do in the intraday. Can we close above 4,000? That's another matter. The Bloomberg U.S. Dollar Index is right now down just about 0.2% at 1271.88, still a long way off the 1350, 1360 levels that we'd seen at the high just about a month ago. And the U.S. 10-year yield is currently rising about 3 basis points. That's a little bit of a headwind to equities right now, 380.01, though still well short of the 420, 425 levels that we saw at the peak in this cycle. Bitcoin right now is down about 1%, but still at the same level that we saw it yesterday at this time, $16,726, as geopolitical tensions really take up the space in the news cycle that FTX had occupied over the last week. Anna, what do you see in terms of Europe?
Yeah, well, the geopolitical situation weighing on Europe today, then, Matt, we do see European stocks under a little bit of pressure this morning, although perhaps that sell-off moderated a little by some of the very cautious language, as I mentioned, from some of the Western leaders. But certainly Eastern European markets coming under some pressure. The reality of being so geographically close to a war zone, not lost on anybody overnight. The London market holding up a little better. Some of the moves higher in the oil price helping to support some oil majors, and that is to the benefit of the London market. Let's have a look at some of the other assets in focus today. This is the auto sector, down by just over 3%. Mercedes in Germany, one of those on the back foot, although Volvo Cars also weaker. Mercedes cutting the price of its EV cars over in the Chinese market is one thing to focus on. Siemens Energy, in fact, was the company I was going to talk about. So we'll note that Siemens is also down by 0.8% in Germany. This is the US dollar against the Polish zloty. Now, yesterday, as we got news break, of course, of this rocket falling in Poland. We did see risk aversion, of course, across a host of assets. We saw the Polish zloty selling off against the euro. We saw the euro sell off against the US dollar. But some of that has unwound. And in the case of the Polish zloty, actually against the euro, it's back to where it was before this news flow broke. And so we'll get an update from Poland in a moment as to what we know and what we don't about what happened. But that is where the market is right now, even if Polish stocks are still under pressure. The euro against the US dollar making its way back up and, in fact, has gone over now the 104 mark as the euro tries to move through this story and tries to focus instead on what was driving it before, and that was some of the interest rate differential expectations with the weaker inflation picture in the United States, Matt.
Let's get back, though, to the geopolitical story. President Biden and key European leaders are urging caution after a rocket struck a village in Poland just over the border from Ukraine. Doubts are growing over whether Russia was directly to blame. Some have suggested it could have been a Russian missile, but one that was knocked off course by a Ukrainian missile defense system. 2 people were killed in the explosion. We've got our team coverage for you. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Piotr Skolimowski in Warsaw, Maria Tadeo in Brussels outside the EU Commission, and Anne-Marie Hordern in Bali, where the G20 was held. Let's start with Piotr in Warsaw. First off, do we think that Poland is going to trigger Article 4 in the NATO treaty today? That would mean that all of the allies get together and, I guess, decide whether or not to trigger Article 5, which is a more aggressive defense clause.
Indeed. Hi, Matt. So the situation is that at this point, it looks increasingly unlikely, or very unlikely, that Poland will trigger Article 4, which would obviously trigger consultation before any response from NATO. The reason is that it looks also unlikely, and we've just seen headlines crossing our terminals that Biden told allies that Polish blast was caused by Ukraine air defense. So, starting from the report that we caught, some unconfirmed report early yesterday after the event was disclosed, that it might have been 2 Russian missiles. What we're hearing now is actually it's just a Russian-made missile, and it hit a town just near the border in Poland. The town called Przewodów, which is just 4 miles away from the border with Ukraine. And it obviously, it killed 2 people on the spot. It hit a farm. So at this point, what we're looking at is probably less severe in case of geopolitical consequences than what we might have feared yesterday when the news first broke.
All right, Bloomberg's Piotr Skolimowski in Warsaw, thank you so much. And just to recap those headlines that Piotr was mentioning, Biden told allies that the Polish blast was caused by Ukraine's air defense. He made those remarks to G7 and NATO allies, described by officials. So, of course, European countries are weighing this incident as well. We heard from Latvia's defense minister here on Bloomberg television yesterday. He said his country will support Poland if they need it.
The next steps, in my view, if this is fully confirmed, should be a much more serious discussion about air defense systems and, in my view, closing at least part of the Ukrainian sky, because we cannot afford another crime against civilians.
Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo is joining us now outside the EU Commission. So, Maria, given the headlines we are getting from Biden, the idea now that it is perhaps Ukraine air defense that is what caused ultimately the deaths of these 2 people, what's the read from Brussels on how to proceed from here?
Well, Kailey, this is a fast-moving situation. Of course, it is a very serious situation, so everyone here is very cautious. But this morning, there is some relief compared to last night, when there was a real sense of panic that kicked in for a few hours, precisely as you say, because made in Russia perhaps does not mean that it was directly fired by Russia. Also, the words from President Biden, which I'm sure Anne-Marie will now get into detail, providing some relief today when it comes to to the European side of the story. Of course, we are waiting to hear from the Secretary General of NATO. NATO is based in Brussels. In fact, I believe there will be a press conference in about an hour, 30 minutes. The Secretary General of NATO saying all of the facts will have to be established and made clear. We know he is in communications with the Polish government. But overall, Kailey, I think today also the situation, an eye-opener, a reminder for Europeans that this war is not happening somewhere far in the world. This is happening in the heart of Europe. The risks are many, and for Eastern Europeans also perhaps validation that they are geographically in a vulnerable situation.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. Obviously, we're all being very cautious with this situation. We appreciate your caution as well, Maria Tadeo, outside the EU Commission. Let's get over to Bali right now. G20 leaders have been gathered there for the G20 summit. President Biden says it's unlikely the rocket which struck inside Poland's border was fired from Russia.
Mr. President, is it too early to say whether this missile was fired from Russia?
There is preliminary information that contests that. I don't want to say that till we completely investigate, but it is. It's unlikely in the minds of the trajectory that it was fired from Russia, but we'll see.
All right, so there are a lot of questions still to be answered. From whence was the missile fired? Who made the missile? Who actually fired it? And, what caused the explosion? Anne-Marie Horton there in Bali. We're just learning that officials say the blast was likely caused by Ukrainian air defense systems. Now, we don't know if that means the air defense system knocked a Russian-fired missile off course or if the Ukrainian air defense system was actually the missile that landed in Poland. Nonetheless, it's a serious situation that's put the world on edge, Anne-Marie.
It certainly is a serious situation that put the world on edge and the G20 summit on edge, which is why you saw early this morning, President was woken up to speak with President Duda of Poland, and then he gathered with the G7 leaders and NATO leaders and then addressed the press. And what you hear from the president, echoed by other leaders like Chancellor Olaf Scholz, who recently was just wrapping up a speech here at the G20, is that they want to remain cautious until the investigation is complete. And they say it would be irresponsible to point fingers right now, given how heightened the concerns is around this. But we should also note there's another point that leaders are talking about, and it is the fact that we would not be talking about the fact of what missile it was, where was it fired from, and the trajectory of that rocket and how it got on the border of Poland and Ukraine if it wasn't for Putin's war in Ukraine.
All right, Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Horton reporting from the G20 in Bali. Thank you so much. Meanwhile, in U.S. domestic political news, former President Donald Trump has formally entered the 2024 presidential race here in the U.S. He announced his candidacy at Mar-a-Lago last night.
In order to make America great and glorious again, I am tonight announcing my candidacy for President of the United States.
And he went on to say in those remarks, Anna, that we will immediately tackle inflation and bring it down to a level where it was. Remember, economic security is national security. So like we saw in the midterms, the economy really being front and center here in the U.S. And of course, that's a global story, Anna.
Yeah, it is a global story. Picking up on the UK side of that, soaring energy prices helped drive inflation even higher than expected in the month of October. The Consumer Price Index rose over 11% from a year ago. Lizzie Burden, Bloomberg UK correspondent, joins us now to break down the inflation data. Lizzie, good morning. So energy prices clearly having an impact here. 11.1%, the latest CPI reading, and talk that we have not peaked yet.
Yes, it's a 41-year high, and as a mark of what an upside surprise it was, only one of the 35 economists surveyed by Bloomberg saw it coming. As you say, driven by gas and electricity price growth, despite the government's support on energy, which means it's even harder for the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt in his fiscal statement tomorrow to withdraw or target that support further. Indeed, what he does on energy is going to be the biggest determinant of where inflation goes from here. We've heard from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, in Bali this morning. He says number one priority for the government is fighting inflation. Take a listen to this.
My absolute number one priority is making sure that we deal with the economic situation that we face at home. With more news of inflation today, it's the number one thing that's on people's minds. It's the thing that's causing most anxiety. Opening up bills, seeing the emails come in with rising prices, and that's why it's right that we grip it. And tomorrow the Chancellor will set out a plan that will enable us to do that.
So the Prime Minister there, but as for the Bank of England, this means one thing, more hikes, and money markets are now pricing for rates to rise to 4.65% by August. Of course, the Bank of England had pushed back against market expectations at its last meeting, but a print like this was not in the script.
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder what it does to the bank's expectations now then. Thank you very much, Lizzie. Bloomberg's Lizzie Burden with the latest on the UK CPI print, working our way towards that autumn statement from the UK government tomorrow. Coming up on the programme, or in fact later in programming, we'll continue our focus on the geopolitics. Alexander Stubb joins us, former Prime Minister of Finland. He'll have a lot to say, of course, on the latest on Poland. And Freya Beamish, TS Lombard Chief Economist, will be with us this hour to talk about where the economy heads next. That's the UK and the global economy, of course. Leslie Vinjamuri, Chatham House Director of the US and the Americas programme, will also join us later this hour to talk about former President Trump and his bid once again for the White House. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. Back to our top story. Leaders are urging caution after a rocket struck a Polish village just over the border from Ukraine. We've just been hearing that President Biden at the G20 has been briefing leaders that this was caused by the Ukrainian defense system. Let's get analysis now. Alexander Stubb joins us, former Prime Minister of Finland and now Director and Professor at the School of Transnational Governance. The facts are thin on the ground, Alexander. Thank you very much for joining us. The impact on Poland, clear, very geographically close, of course, to a war zone. And now we get a reminder of the dangers of that situation. What is your early assessment of how the West should treat these latest developments?
Well, in my experience, it's very important for all parties involved, including the governments, to simply remain cool, calm and collected. And that's pretty much what we saw last night, because, of course, were you to judge things over Twitter, there would have been a full-blown revocation of Article 5 and escalation of the conflict. I think it's very good to go through the facts on the ground and see what's happening, what's happened, and then make an assessment what the necessary action is.
So from a NATO perspective, would you expect to see action taken here, Alexander? And what might that be? There's been talk of Poland wanting to trigger Article 4, which is essentially more conversations and talking about a possibility of response, not Article 5, of course, but Article 4. Others are saying this leads to more urgency to try and introduce some kind of no-fly zone around the border areas. What would your assessment be of what NATO should do?
Of course, I have to be very careful on two accounts. One, I come from a country which is not yet a NATO member state. And then, of course, two, I don't have the latest intel. But I can imagine that the line of action is to talk around Article 4, what kind of action is needed. And I think politically what we'll probably see is more support for Ukraine. So this could have something to do with no-flight zones, or it could have something to do with missile defense systems from the air, because these types of accidents shouldn't happen. They're in many ways dangerous, and also a reminder of how really close we are to Europe. We're in the center of Europe with this conflict, and it shouldn't spill over.
You are very close indeed to Russia as well. I wonder, I mean, not now, I believe you're in Italy, but of course, when you're in Finland, you're right next door. How much of a concern is this aggression from a neighbor? How much of a concern do Finnish citizens have that Russia could come for them next?
Well, I think our NATO membership is basically an indication that the level of fear in Finland and among the population was increased. So the feeling was that if Putin can do this to Ukraine, why couldn't he do it to Finland? Now, the realities of the ground right now are, of course, different in the sense that we are in Finland very well prepared for an escalation, but we do not think that that will happen. We think that Putin, Russia, and his military has his hands full right now in Ukraine, and for all intents and purposes is not exactly showing a stellar performance. So I think Finns are quite calm at this stage. We feel very secure about the situation on our border.
How involved can Finland and NATO get in the defense of Ukraine? We've seen, obviously, weapons shipments constantly throughout this Russian war, as well as money transfers. Are you also able to help train Ukrainian army soldiers to use these weapons? Can you conduct any kind of air defense close to the borders? How close can we get?
Well, I'd say that there is ample coordination taking place inside the European Union, which has been in the front line on the sanctions policy, and of course in NATO as well. But then the actual action, in other words, providing military equipment, providing finance, or providing training, that is very much bilateral. And from what I understand, the Finnish government, for instance, has taken 9 or 10 decisions on sending arms. And from the reports that I read, there have also been Finns, not government official, but Finns helping Ukrainians to use those weapons and train them. So it's this type of intergovernmental bilateral support that a lot of countries in Europe, whether NATO states or not, are giving at the moment. And I think that's a good thing, and I think we're going to see more of it.
Alexander, you've taken care to mention that you are speaking not as a member of NATO, which Finland still is not. Do these events in Poland increase the urgency for Finland and Sweden to join that alliance?
Well, yes and no. I mean, again, I feel quite comfortable where we are because we do have bilateral security guarantees, for instance, signed with the United Kingdom. I would also argue that we have bilateral security guarantees from the United States. And given that we're basically in the waiting door, just outside the door for full membership, we do feel quite covered. And I think that other NATO member states like Hungary and Turkey, which still haven't ratified our membership, realize that we are actually a security provider in the Baltic Sea region. So I wouldn't make the final ratification or the press of the button the big issue here. De facto, we are already members of NATO.
And finally, Alexander, we are seeing here in the U.S. funding for Ukraine being a little bit of a political issue. There is waning support for that here domestically in certain sectors of the political economy here. What is your sense of the unity of support among Ukraine's allies at this point, and how soon could it start to deteriorate?
Well, we don't live in a perfect world, so don't expect everything to happen in unison. There'll always be sideline conversations and a little bit of opposition. I am actually positively surprised that war fatigue has not hit in yet. And I think these types of events and the types of, I would say criminal attacks on civilian targets by Russia will increase the unity. So the European Union has already agreed to give over 1.5 billion euros per month. Top that with the bilateral aid. I think we all understand that we have to help Ukraine on 2 accounts. One is to win this war, and 2 is with reconstruction. So I do expect the support to continue with, of course, a few side noises on the way.
All right, Alexander Stubb, the former Prime Minister of Finland, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Now let's keep you up to date with other news from around the world with the first word. Apple is taking a major step toward reducing its reliance on Asian production. Bloomberg has learned the company is prepared to begin sourcing chips for its devices from a plant being built in Arizona. Apple CEO Tim Cook has said the factory will start up in 2024. Senator Rick Scott will challenge Mitch McConnell for the chamber's top Republican leadership post today. Allies of the two men have been trading blame for the GOP's disappointing performance in last week's elections. McConnell says he has the votes to continue as the Republican leader. And it's NASA's most powerful rocket in 50 years. Early today, it roared into space, carrying an uncrewed capsule on a 25-day mission to orbit the moon and safely return to Earth. The flight kicks off NASA's multi-mission Artemis mission, which is focused on sending astronauts back to the moon's surface by as early as 2025. So, Anna, rockets rocketing into space and inflation continuing to rocket higher in the UK, where you are, and that is where we will be focusing next.
Yep, safely with our feet on the ground then. We'll stick to the macro conversation next. We'll get to Freya Beamish, TS Lombard Chief Economist, who'll join us. We'll get her reflections on the UK economy as we see that inflation picture in the UK continuing to gain ground at a 41-year high. So far from the peak inflation conversation that's happening in the United States, it seems that the UK conversation, inflation set to linger longer, and perhaps we don't see a peak until the spring. We'll get Freya's view next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. Here's what you need to know. President Biden and key European leaders urge caution after a rocket hit a village in Poland. Uncertainty remains over who fired it and from where, but President Biden at the G20 has been briefing that this was possibly as a result of Ukrainian air defenses. It's official, Donald Trump is running for president again. His announcement comes as some Republicans are saying it's time for the former president to move on. Inflation hasn't been this high in the UK since 1981. The latest numbers show the consumer price index up more than 11% in the last year. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. And Matt, markets really shaken by the geopolitical headwinds over the last 24 hours or so, but now looking a little calmer, waiting for confirmation of what exactly happened between Ukraine on that Ukraine-Poland border, and looking perhaps to try and move on to some macro trends.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we did come down pretty significantly yesterday, only to recover by the close. In terms of the S&P 500, we were up about 1.5%, and then dropped down to but came back to close up 0.8%. We closed at 39.91. You can see futures right now pushing up 1/3% to 4,012. So we didn't close above the 4,000 level, but very close, and we could head up through there, at least intraday today as well. We'll see if we can hold that close. The dollar has been really important in terms of a headwind when it's strong and a tailwind when it's weak for equities. So it inversely correlated, so to speak. Right now it's down, and that should mean that risk assets go up. You can see the Bloomberg U.S. dollar index at 1271. The U.S. 10-year yield also has been inversely correlated, and you can see that the 10-year yield is currently up right now, just about 1 or 2 basis points to 378.81. But it doesn't look like it's strong enough to derail the futures gain that we're seeing right now, as slight as it may be. Bitcoin down 1% from wherever we measure the close. I don't know if it's midnight or 5 p.m. yesterday, but the point should be it was exactly at this point yesterday, $16,700. Of course, Bitcoin never really stops trading. It just continues 24/7, 365, and it has been really the focus of the news cycle until this geopolitical event yesterday pushed it out. And I guess now we're still going to talk about FTX, Kailey. We're still going to talk about earnings, but it's very important to deal with or to see how nations deal with this missile in Poland.
Yeah, definitely a lot of things for this market to keep tabs on. But earnings, as you mentioned, Matt, is one of them because we still have companies reporting, including Advance Auto, which is an auto parts retailer. It reported after the bell yesterday, missed expectations, cut its outlook. Analysts pretty disappointed with the report overall, and the stock is getting hit hard in pre-market trading as a result, down about 13%. You also have a big decline for Carnival Cruise Lines. This is after it offered a private offering of convertible notes of about $1 billion. So that stock is down about 12%, and interesting to see that filtering through to its peers in the cruise space as well. Norwegian down about 3.3%. Royal Caribbean also lower by about 2.5% before the bell, Anna.
Those are some of the stock specifics to watch then stateside as we get towards the start of the US trading day. Here in Europe, a couple of hours into our trading session, we're down by 0.4%. The first chance, of course, for European stocks to react to what happened in Poland early in the European evening yesterday. So we see some tentative moves a little bit lower. The London market outperforms, though, because energy stocks are actually going higher on a higher oil price. The auto sector is underperforming. Mercedes is one of the stocks in focus there. They've reduced the price of some of their cars, their EV vehicles over in China. The Polish zloty, of course, in focus, and this actually showing that the US dollar is down against the zloty, so the zloty gaining ground that it lost late yesterday. We saw the zloty sold off against the euro and the US dollar yesterday. We also saw that the euro sold off against the US dollar, but both of those risk-off moves have been unwound to a large degree as the market tries to get some sense of really what happened on that Poland-Ukraine border. 6 kilometers into Poland, of course, is where that rocket landed, and and a few details still missing as to what exactly happened there, but the market trying to move on from that story, it would seem, Kailey.
All right, Anna, well, let's focus back on the story in the UK with an 11.1% inflation print earlier today. Joining us to discuss is Freya Beamish, TS Lombard Chief Economist. Freya, how close are we to the peak, and what does that mean for the BOE?
I think exactly where the peak in the year-over-year rate comes. I would focus in on the month-on-month moves in the core, and that was disappointing in the October data. So what we have to remember as economists is that the pass-through always takes longer than we expect. The lags are always longer than we expect. But my source of optimism in this case, in terms of the near-term trajectory of UK inflation going into the first half of next year, is that if the US can print a good inflation print, then the UK can, because there's no the demand-supply underlying mismatch in the UK economy is not greater than that of the US economy. So I think what we're seeing here is still continuation of the feed-through from energy prices, food prices to an extent, the depreciation of sterling, and it's all just taking a very long time to be digested into the real economy.
Isn't that a huge differentiator, Freya? Isn't the depreciation of sterling a big differentiator between the UK inflation problem and the US inflation problem? And in fact, just one of many differentiators?
Yep, absolutely. And I think that's why we're still seeing UK CPI print higher or continue to be worrying rather than the less worrying numbers that came through from the US. And we're probably still in that camp into next year. But it is all kind of cost push feeding through to the domestic situation. There is underlying a demand-supply mismatch, but that is the same for the US as it is for the UK. It's just there's more kind of cost push inflation. So that's why I make the comparison between the US and the UK in terms of what the Bank of England can actually have an impact on. The kind of the demand-supply mismatch is no greater in the UK than it is in the US. And in fact, if I was looking just at that pure kind of domestically generated inflation, what starts to bring down prices is when demand starts to crumble. And the UK has the energy shock that is destroying demand. They have the yields that are destroying demand, and all of that feeds through much more quickly in the UK than it does elsewhere.
Okay, given how hot this inflation print was, Freya, and we talked about the headline, you said you referenced the core number as well. What does that do to Bank of England attempts to talk down market-based measures of rates? Because the BOE objected to how high the markets had pushed interest rate expectations previously.
It's a big spoke in the wheel. I think the Bank of England is right that we're unlikely to see terminal rates go anywhere near where they were, certainly at the height of the Truss Kwarteng kind of debacle, up at that kind of 6% terminal rate, above 5%. The point is that UK demand is much more responsive to the shocks that we've seen than even on the continent. So there's a higher proportion of the energy sector, which is privately owned. Therefore, the price shocks feed through more quickly. There's most of the vast majority of mortgages are on 1 to 5 year fixed rates, and therefore the yield shock feeds through much more quickly than it does on the continent. So demand is really going to crumble much more quickly in the UK than elsewhere, and that does the Bank of England's job for it. It's bringing that demand-supply mismatch back into line. Further down the line, we can have this conversation again, because I think that all of the kind of the disinflation mirage that I've just talked about is in fact a mirage, and that the entire global economy is going to a higher inflation rate to the tune of kind of 3% for the US and probably the UK, Freya, rather than the 2%. But Freya, that's for further down the line.
We had, markets breathed a sigh of relief and really put in buy orders after CPI came in under estimates at 7.7%. We were looking for 7.9%, still incredibly high. Yesterday, we saw a similar story with PPI down to 8 even. We were looking for 8.3. Are you saying that's a mirage? We don't have, inflation getting back under control in this country?
I think it is a mirage, but I think the mirage can last for quite a long time. So We've had a fake recession in the first half of the year, and now we might have kind of fake inflation slowdown just based on kind of the extreme heat of COVID coming off again. But there are really fundamental shifts within the global economy, within global labor markets, particularly with the relationship between the Chinese labor market and developed market labor markets that point to higher inflation. I could list a whole bunch of secular trends that suggest that we're moving in the direction of higher inflation. So that's the sense in which I mean that this is a kind of a mirage as inflation comes back down. I think I can easily construct a way in which you get US core inflation to 4%, 3-month annualized rates by Q2 of next year. You have to get zero increase in core goods inflation. And you have to get zero input from transportation services. So oil has to stay contained, which is possible. So I can construct that kind of mirage of disinflation lasting quite long. But where does that leave the Fed when you get into the first half of it next year? It leaves them looking tight, and therefore they start to cut much more quickly than people are expecting. So we're more hawkish on the way up, but we're also more dovish on the way back down.
And on your subject of the mirage, it reminds me of the Apple story. They're talking increasingly about sourcing chips from home, and you wonder if that's a deglobalization trends that other businesses are on, where that takes us. Freya, thank you so much for joining us. Freya Beamish of TS Lombard. Coming up, we'll return to US politics. Leslie Vinjamuri joins us, Chatham House Director of the US and America's program, a day after we heard from former President Trump that he wants to run again. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the Principal Room. Coming up later today, an interview with European Central Bank Vice President Luis de Guindos. That's at 12 p.m. in London, 7 a.m. in New York. This is Bloomberg.
This is a movement. This is not for any one individual. This is a job for tens of millions of proud people working together from all across the land and from all walks of life, young and old, black and white, Hispanic and Asian, many of whom we have brought together for the very, very first time.
Donald Trump there announcing his 2024 run at Mar-a-Lago in Florida last night. Joining us now is Leslie Vinjamuri, Chatham House Director of the U.S. and the Americas program. Leslie, we knew this was coming in a sense, but I think it's really interesting because he doesn't seem to have the kind of momentum that he had coming out of the presidency. And I wonder if you think he kind of splits the Republican Party pretty seriously here.
Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people in his own party. We've seen those interviews that clearly, at a minimum, were hoping that that Donald Trump would wait until after that December 6th runoff in Georgia to make this announcement, primarily because his party and so many people around him understand that he is not delivering the goods. Those midterm election results, those candidates that he backed across key races for Secretary of State, key races for governor and battleground states, most of them lost. And so I think we have seen a division, not only at the top, but, across all levels of the party, whether it's, McConnell facing a challenger, McCarthy not getting 100% of those votes in the first round, DeSantis clearly coming up as somebody who looks set to challenge President Trump. So this is a complicated next step, but for the entire Republican Party, it's complicated.
So it's a fractious Republican Party, Leslie. What about the Democratic Party? Because that isn't necessarily a picture of perfect unity either, considering you have the more moderate ring, the likes of Joe Manchin, which has caused some difficulty in getting legislation through, and then the progressives on the other end.
Absolutely. But, that's a conversation we've been having for 2 full years. And so that the Republican Party is getting the attention now because this is new. Donald Trump had a grasp, he had a grip on that party. So, yes, the Democrats have come through this election looking far better than most people anticipated, riding a high at this moment. Inflation, looking a tiny bit better in the short term. The war in Ukraine looking, different. So once the new Congress convenes, of course, we're going to see a much more difficult picture for President Biden. Any, future legislation will come to abrupt halt. There will be investigations of the president, of his family. The Democratic Party knows this. They've been preparing for this. That's why we've seen so much push on getting legislation through. We're going to see more in this window, this narrow window. We're already seeing the announcement yesterday, the ask for another $48 billion. But yes, both parties are now going to face some very important questions as they lead up to, it's still a long ways off, that primary season, but that is what is in their line of sight.
Right, a long way off, and yet we've heard from former President Trump already, Leslie. What difference will it make that the US media landscape has changed its view? Some prominent players, at least, have changed their view of Donald Trump since he was in office.
I think this is a really important point. The fact that Murdoch has pulled his support, that the Wall Street Journal, Fox, the New York Post are all coming out both against Donald Trump and in favor of Ron DeSantis is a very significant fact. This is a former president who came to power on so much free press coverage, even from those who didn't like him. So I think the next question is the coverage negative? It's going to be, but is it going to drop? And we did see, last night during his very long speech that at a certain point, the media pulled the plug and stopped covering it.
Well, and also, does Donald Trump use this as a bargaining chip, eventually trading his support for DeSantis for guaranteed immunity from future prosecution?
Yeah, that's going to be hard. Courts, despite the better hopes of some people, very prominent people, courts remain independent. And I think quite determined to pursue the cases that they're looking at. So, beyond
a presidential pardon always helps.
A bargain always helps, but I would be surprised, but I guess nothing is off the table.
Leslie, finally, just quickly, you raised the issue of Ukraine a few times here and the idea that the Biden administration is going to try and push through billions more in funding before a Republican House could make that more difficult come January. Where does the U.S. and allies stand now, especially as we all assess the headlines coming from Poland in the last 24 hours?
Well, I think, the number one thing on that specific, what's happened, the missiles that we saw yesterday or overnight, first of all, investigations and clear, considered effort to determine exactly what happened. We'll see President Biden and America's NATO allies coming together to take very careful, very well-considered, very measured decisions about how to respond in a way that won't escalate, but will send a very strong message. Should the determination be that those were Russian missiles, that there was an intentionality, all questions that we have yet to see. The bigger question, of course, is that I do think that there's going to be a considerable effort to keep NATO allies aligned. I don't really see, what we were worried about before, that the Republicans would peel off America's support for Ukraine. Yes, there will be questions. Yes, there will be oversight, but the American public continues to be on the side of supporting Ukraine, especially as things have looked better and pushing forward so that I don't think we're there yet, but when we get to the point where there is a prospect for a settlement and for a serious negotiation, that Ukraine's in a very good position in that negotiation.
Leslie, thanks very much for your time. Leslie Vinjamuri joining us from Chatham House. And sticking with this theme of US politics, coming up on Balance of Power, Senator Ben Cardin joins the team, Democrat from Maryland. And that conversation is at 12 p.m. in New York, 5 p.m. in London. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Anna Edwards in London with Matt Miller and Kailey Leinz in New York. Now, TikTok is addressing US national security concerns, partnering with Oracle in storing cloud data in what it calls Project Texas. This, as the popular Chinese-owned video app, comes under FBI scrutiny. We spoke with the TikTok CEO at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore.
We're going to move the data that we store in Virginia and in Singapore into Oracle's cloud infrastructure. That's our partner. Oracle's going to look after it for us. We're going to have new and improved data access protocols such that only an entity of U.S. residents that in the U.S. will have access to a certain set of U.S. protected data.
Obviously now the others are trying to catch up. What do you make of all the copycats? I mean, you have Instagram and Reels, you have YouTube with the Shorts. Elon Musk has at least mused about bringing back Vine. How worried are you that they're going to get it right and do something similar?
It doesn't really come as a surprise that many other products are adapting and adopting the short video format. You know, for us, we come back to this. We believe we have a very unique mission and vision that we want to build. And every other company is a little bit different like that. So we're very confident in our ability to deliver our mission to our users in a way that the competitors won't be able to.
Now, if the Biden administration goes back to the Trump view and tries to force a sale, do you have a plan B?
Because of the discussions that we are having with the U.S. government, we are confident we can come with a reasonable solution to the national security issues. And so we are confident that that's a situation we can avoid.
That was the CEO of TikTok speaking at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum in Singapore with our very own Reda Grigori. And that New Economy Forum continues today and throughout the week. But let's take a look at what else is ahead today. It is the final day of the G20 summit in Bali, where the war in Ukraine is front and center in conversation. Then at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, the BOE Governor Andrew Bailey appears before the Treasury Committee to answer questions about the quarterly monetary policy report released this month. Plus, we have ECB President Christine Lagarde speaking at 12 p.m. And the earnings continue here in the U.S., Matt. We have results from retailers like Target, Lowe's, TJX, and of course it'll be interesting to see if Target follows Walmart, its peer yesterday, which had its best day since July 2020 after its results.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, front and center for both Target and Walmart is the inventory story, right? How much have they sold off of the excess inventory that we've all been watching, and how are they preparing for a holiday season? That'll be interesting as, Anna, you know, some of the shipping companies like FedEx is furloughing people, and we're going to hear from, I think, DHL tomorrow.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really interesting story to watch. Logistics providers and what they're telling us about how quickly the U.S. economy or the global economy decelerate towards the end of this year. Certainly a theme we watch. That is it for Early Edition. Surveillance is ahead. Tom, John and Lisa will be here with you to take you through the news. This is Bloomberg.